It started with a simple plan: a weekend getaway to a secluded cabin in the woods. I had been feeling burnout from work, and a few days of peace and quiet was all I needed. I had rented the cabin online, and the reviews mentioned how remote and tranquil it was. Exactly what I wanted. I packed a bag with enough clothes for a few days, a few books, and some snacks, then headed out. The drive was long, twisting through winding roads with no sign of civilization for miles. The further I went, the more isolated the landscape became. Tall trees lined both sides of the road, and the deep silence of the woods was overwhelming. I couldn't remember the last time I had been this far from everything. My phone had no signal, and I could feel the weight of the world slipping away with every mile. Eventually, I reached the dirt road that led up to the cabin. It was barely wide enough for one car, but I made it to the clearing. The cabin itself was modest, a small wooden structure that looked as though it had been there for decades. It was tucked back behind a line of trees, offering plenty of privacy. I grabbed my bags and went inside. The cabin smelled like old wood and dust, a familiar scent that made the place feel cozy. The furniture was basic: a sofa, a couple of chairs, and a small kitchen with old-fashioned appliances. It wasn't luxurious, but it was perfect for someone who just wanted to escape for a few days. I turned on the old gas-powered lanterns, which gave the room a soft, warm glow. The firewood was already stacked by the hearth, and the crackling flames brought a sense of calm that I made myself a simple dinner, nothing fancy, and sat by the fire, reading one of the books I'd brought. The night was clear and still outside. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl from the woods. The peace I'd been craving settled in. But as the night wore on, I started to feel uneasy. The cabin was so quiet, unnaturally quiet. No sounds of insects, no rustling of leaves outside, just an overwhelming silence. My mind started to wander. I could have sworn I heard something faint. Footsteps, maybe? I brushed it off, convincing myself that it was just my imagination. I went to bed early, exhausted from the drive and the quieting of my mind. I wrapped myself in the thick blanket and tried to sleep. But as soon as I closed my eyes, the feeling of being watched came over me. My pulse quickened, and I lay still in the dark, listening. I could hear the soft creaks of the cabin settling, the wind picking up outside. But every so often, I thought I heard something else. Faint footsteps just outside the door. I got up and checked, but the porch was empty. I convinced myself that I was just being paranoid. After all, it was just me in the cabin. I locked the door again, crawled back into bed, and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I woke up to find fresh footprints in the snow outside the cabin. They weren't there when I'd arrived. They were too large to be mine, and they didn't seem to lead anywhere. The tracks stopped at the cabin's back door and just disappeared. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't sure what to think. I hadn't seen anyone on my drive-in. No one had passed me on the road. Who could have left these prints? Over the next few days, the strange feeling only grew. Every time I stepped outside, I felt like I wasn't alone. I checked the perimeter of the cabin multiple times, but found nothing unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that someone was watching me from the woods. The feeling came in waves, sometimes strong, sometimes weak. But it was always there, lurking in the back of my mind. I tried to enjoy the trip despite my unease. I went for a hike, explored the surrounding forest, and tried to read as much as I could. But the silence of the woods was oppressive. It wasn't the peaceful silence I had imagined. It was the kind of silence that made you question your own presence in the world. That night, as I sat by the fire, the feeling of being watched came back again, stronger than before. I couldn't explain it. It was like someone was standing just outside the window, waiting for me to turn around. I jumped every time a branch tapped against the window. My heart raced, but when I looked out, the darkness of the woods revealed nothing. No movement, no sounds. I couldn't stand it anymore. I needed to know what was going on. I went through the cabin, opening every drawer, inspecting every corner. It was then that I noticed something strange. One of the cabinets in the kitchen was slightly ajar. Inside, there was an old rusty key and a scrap of paper, covered in what looked like old, faded handwriting. The paper read, "Don't trust the man in the woods. He's waiting for you." I stared at the message, a cold shiver running down my spine. Who had left this here? Was it a joke? Or was there something more sinister at play? I didn't want to find out, but at the same time, I couldn't leave without answers. That night, I gathered all my courage and decided to confront whatever was lurking out there. I grabbed the key from the cabinet and went outside with a flashlight. The woods were pitch black, the trees swaying ominously in the wind. I walked towards the edge of the forest, my mind racing. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I had to find out what was going on. I made my way deeper into the woods, using the key in my pocket as a reminder to keep going. Then, just as I was about to turn back, I saw something in the distance, faint lights glowing from between the trees. I moved toward the lights cautiously, my heart pounding. As I got closer, I realized that they weren't lights at all, just reflections off a rusted metal door, partially hidden in the overgrown brush. My curiosity got the better of me and I approached it. The door creaked open with a push, revealing a small, abandoned shed. Inside, I found old tools, broken furniture, and an old bed, its sheets long rotted away. But there was something else. On the far wall, scratched into the wood, was the same message I'd found on the paper. "Don't trust the man in the woods." It hit me then. I wasn't alone. There was someone out there, someone who had been watching me, but I didn't know who or why. I heard a rustling behind me, and before I could react, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was a man, dirty, disheveled, and wearing tattered clothes. His eyes locked onto mine, and I froze. "You shouldn't have come here," he said in a low, rasping voice. I stepped back, heart racing. I didn't know whether to run or try to reason with him. But before I could decide, the man turned and disappeared into the woods, vanishing as quickly as he had appeared. I didn't stick around to find out more. I turned and ran back to the cabin, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The man in the woods wasn't some random stranger. He had been here watching me. But why? What did he want? When I finally made it back to the cabin, I locked every door and window, and I didn't leave again until the sun rose. By morning, the woods were still, and the cabin was quiet. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still out there, waiting. The next day, I packed my things and left. I didn't even look back. I had come for peace and solitude, but instead, I had found something far more disturbing. The cabin was beautiful, but it was no place for me. The woods had secrets, and I wasn't sure I ever wanted to know them. Conclusion. The end of the story as I drove away. I could see the cabin in my rearview mirror, sitting there in the woods, as if nothing had ever happened. I left the place behind, knowing I'd never return. Whatever had happened in those woods, I didn't want to be a part of it anymore. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still feel the man's gaze on me, watching from the trees. I try to push it out of my mind, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never forget the man in the woods. I wasn't planning on spending the night in the cabin. It was supposed to be a quick stop to check it out and stretch my legs before continuing on the drive. I was on my way back to Vermont after a visit to some old friends in Maine. The cabin was something I'd stumbled across online, an old listing for a property that had been taken off the market years ago. The photos were rough, showing a rundown building tucked deep into the woods. It looked like nobody had touched it in decades. That's what intrigued me. I don't know why I felt the urge to detour. Maybe it was boredom or the monotony of the highway. Maybe it was the way the cabin reminded me of the woods where I grew up. The drive out there wasn't too bad, just a few winding dirt roads, the kind that shake your car enough to make you feel like you're leaving civilization behind. I had enough gas, my phone was fully charged, and I figured I'd be back on the road in a couple of hours at most. When I got there, the place was even more dilapidated than I expected. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, their branches so thick they blocked out most of the daylight. The roof sagged in the middle and the front porch had partially collapsed. The windows were dusty and cracked, and the whole place smelled like wet wood and mildew. I parked a little ways off and walked up the path. My boots crunched on the gravel, and each step seemed louder than it should have been in the stillness of the forest. There wasn't a single sound, no birds, no wind, nothing. I told myself that was normal this deep in the woods, but it put me on edge anyway. The front door was unlocked, which didn't surprise me. The lock was rusted and broken, hanging loosely from the frame. Inside, the cabin was a mess. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and every step kicked up a fine layer of dust. There was a table in the corner with one leg missing, a couple of chairs, and a wood-burning stove that had seen better days. Old newspapers and magazines were scattered everywhere, yellowed and brittle with age. I walked through the small rooms, feeling like an intruder. The kitchen had a rusty sink and empty cabinets, most of them hanging open like someone had rifled through them and left in a hurry. The bedroom had a metal bed frame with a stained mattress that sagged in the middle. The smell in there was worse, stale and sour, like something had been left to rot. I found a few odd things that didn't make sense. In the bedroom closet, there was a pile of clothes, men's and women's, all decades out of style. A suitcase sat in the corner, empty except for a handful of faded photographs. The people in the photos were smiling, but their faces were blurred, like the camera hadn't been steady when the picture was taken. The strangest thing was the basement. The door to it was padlocked, but the wood around the lock was soft and splintered. It looked like someone had tried to force it open, unsuccessfully. I didn't have any tools with me, so I left it alone, but the sight of it nagged at me. I should have left then. I should have gotten back in my car and driven away. But something about the place held me there. It wasn't curiosity exactly. It was more like a heavy feeling in my chest, like I was being weighed down. I decided to sit on the porch for a while and have a snack. I'd packed some sandwiches and a thermos of coffee, and the fresh air seemed like it would do me good. The quiet outside was unsettling, but at least it didn't smell like mold and decay. That's when I noticed the tracks. They were faint but unmistakable, boot prints in the dirt near the edge of the clearing. They weren't mine. They were too big, and the tread didn't match. They led off into the woods, disappearing between the trees. I stood there for a long time, staring at those tracks and trying to convince myself they didn't mean anything. Maybe they were old, I thought. Maybe a hunter or hiker had passed through weeks ago. But the dirt wasn't dry. It had rained the day before, and the ground was still damp. The tracks couldn't have been more than a day old. I packed up my things and went back inside. My plan was to check the place one more time just to make sure nobody else was around, and then leave. The idea of someone else being out there, watching me, made my skin crawl. Inside, everything looked the same. I checked the small bathroom, the bedroom, and the kitchen again, but there was no sign of anyone. The only place I didn't check was the basement. The locked door felt like it was daring me, but I didn't have the nerve. I was about to leave when I heard it. A faint creak, like a floorboard shifting under weight, came from the back of the cabin, near the bedroom. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it, but then it came again. I wanted to run, but I couldn't make my legs move. Slowly, I crept toward the bedroom, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. The door was open, just as I'd left it, but the room looked different. The closet door was ajar now, and I was sure I'd closed it before. I didn't go any closer. Instead, I backed away, keeping my eyes on the bedroom door. My mind was racing with excuses. Maybe the wind had shifted the door, or maybe I hadn't closed it as tightly as I thought. But the air inside was still, and there was no draft. I grabbed my bag and headed for the front door. As I stepped onto the porch, I heard another sound. A faint rustling, like fabric brushing against wood, came from inside the cabin, but I didn't look back. I ran to my car, started the engine, and didn't stop driving until I was back on the main road. I didn't call the police. What would I have told them? That I'd found an old cabin in the woods and thought I'd heard something? They would have dismissed it as paranoia, and maybe they would have been right. But I can't stop thinking about that place. About the tracks in the dirt, the locked basement, and the way the closet door had moved. I'll never know for sure what was in that cabin, but I know one thing. I'm not going back. And whoever or whatever was out there, I hope they stay far away from me. I decided to rent a small cabin deep in the woods for a week. I needed a break from the rush of daily life and thought some solitude would do me good. The cabin wasn't luxurious, but it seemed cozy enough in the pictures. A single room with a kitchenette, a small bathroom, and a wood stove for heating. It was surrounded by dense forest, with a clearing that allowed sunlight to seep in during the day. The remoteness appealed to me. No neighbors, no Wi-Fi, and no phone service. Just what I was looking for. The first day went smoothly. I arrived in the late afternoon, unloaded my bags, and settled in. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of pine. Inside the cabin, it smelled faintly of wood smoke and old timber. I lit the wood stove, unpacked some canned food, and got comfortable. As the sun set, the temperature dropped quickly. I wrapped myself in a thick blanket and watched the flames dance in the stove until I drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I woke up feeling rested. The sun peeked through the windows, casting a warm glow over the room. After breakfast, I decided to explore the area. The forest was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves and distant bird calls. The ground was soft with fallen pine needles, and the trees stretched high above, their tops swaying gently in the wind. I felt small but not insignificant, like I was part of something much larger than myself. About an hour into my walk, I stumbled upon a trail that wasn't marked on the map. It was narrow, overgrown in places, and seemed to lead deeper into the woods. Curious, I followed it for a while. The further I went, the less distinct the trail became, until it was almost impossible to tell if it was a path at all. I decided to turn back before I got lost. As I retraced my steps, I noticed something odd. I didn't remember seeing a particular cluster of rocks on my way in. It unsettled me, but I chalked it up to being distracted earlier. Back at the cabin, I spent the rest of the day reading and writing in my journal. As night fell, the forest came alive with sounds. Crickets chirping, owls hooting, and the occasional snap of a twig. It was peaceful in a way, but also unnerving. The darkness outside felt heavy, almost oppressive. I made sure to lock the door and double-check the windows before going to bed. On the third day, I decided to gather firewood. The cabin came with a small stack, but it wouldn't last the week if the nights stayed as cold as they had been. I ventured out with an axe and a sturdy pair of gloves. The work was tiring but satisfying. Each swing of the axe echoed through the trees, and the fresh scent of cut wood filled the air. I piled the logs in my arms and carried them back to the cabin in several trips. While stacking the wood beside the cabin, I noticed something odd. There were faint impressions in the dirt near the edge of the clearing. They looked like footprints, but not the kind a boot or shoe would make. These were bare, slightly larger than my own, and the toes seemed unusually long. I stared at them for a while, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Eventually, I convinced myself they must have been left by some animal, though none I could think of matched the shape. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The sounds outside seemed louder than before. I heard something moving through the underbrush, slow and deliberate. It wasn't the random scurrying of a small animal. Whatever it was big. I stayed perfectly still, straining to hear more. The noise stopped just as suddenly as it had started. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe even a bear. Still, I kept the axe close by, just in case. By the fourth day, my unease had grown. The forest no longer felt peaceful. It felt like it was watching me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out here. I decided to stay close to the cabin that day. I cleaned, rearranged some things, and tried to distract myself with small tasks. But every so often, I'd glance out the window, half expecting to see something or someone standing at the edge of the clearing. In the afternoon, I went out to split more firewood. The air was still, and the sky was overcast, casting a dull light over everything. As I worked, I became aware of a strange sound. It was faint at first, like a low hum or a distant engine. It grew louder, and I realized it wasn't coming from the sky but from the forest. It was rhythmic, almost like chanting, though I couldn't make out any words. My stomach tightened. I dropped the axe and stood there, listening, trying to pinpoint the source. Just as quickly as it had started, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was even more unnerving. That night was the worst yet. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of something tapping on the cabin wall. It was slow and deliberate, like someone knocking with a single knuckle. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the dying embers in the stove. The tapping moved, circling the cabin. I grabbed the axe and crept toward the window. My hands were shaking as I pulled back the curtain, but there was nothing there, just darkness. I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching the axe and staring at the door. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the wind outside, set my nerves on edge. When dawn finally came, I felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. When I stepped outside, I found more footprints in the dirt. They circled the cabin and led off into the woods. My heart sank. Someone or something had been out there. I decided to leave early. I packed my things quickly, loading them into the car. As I did, I kept glancing at the tree line, half expecting to see a face staring back at me. Once everything was packed, I locked the cabin door behind me and got in the car. The engine started without issue, and I pulled out of the clearing, my eyes flicking between the road and the rearview mirror. As I drove down the narrow forest road, I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. I was leaving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I finally reached the main road, the tension in my chest began to ease. The forest thinned out, replaced by open fields and scattered houses. Looking back, I still don't know what I encountered during those few days in the cabin. Maybe it was just my imagination, amplified by the isolation and the eerie silence of the woods. Or maybe there really was someone or something out there watching me. Either way, I haven't gone back. I've always thought of myself as someone who's good at being alone. It's probably because I grew up in a small town where solitude wasn't an option. It was just life. After years of living in the city, surrounded by people, noise, and the constant buzz of life, I found myself craving that solitude again. That's why I decided to rent a cabin in the woods for a week. Nothing fancy, just a one-room cabin tucked away in the Adirondacks. I wanted to disconnect, no emails, no social media, no calls. Just me, the trees, and the sound of my own thoughts. I found the cabin on a rental site. It was small, rustic, and about 2 miles from the nearest road. The pictures showed a cozy interior with a wood stove, a tiny kitchen, and a single bed pushed up against a window. Perfect. The owner, a man named Bill, mentioned in his email that there was no cell service, but there was a landline for emergencies. That sealed the deal for me. The drive up was uneventful. The roads got narrower and rougher the closer I got to the cabin. By the time I reached the spot where I had to park, my car was coated in dust, and my back ached from bouncing over potholes. I parked in a small clearing and slung my backpack over my shoulder, leaving the rest of my gear in the car. The trail to the cabin was well marked, and it only took me about 30 minutes to hike in. The cabin looked exactly like the pictures, maybe a little smaller. It sat in a clearing surrounded by tall pines and birches. The air smelled clean, sharp with the scent of pine needles. I could hear a creek somewhere nearby, the water gurgling over rocks. Inside, the cabin was as simple as it could get. A small wood stove stood in one corner with a stack of firewood next to it. The kitchen had an old sink, a 2-burner propane stove, and a few cabinets. The bed was as basic as it looked in the photos, just a wooden frame and a thin mattress. A single window above the bed let in the afternoon light. There wasn't much to unpack. I set my bag on the bed and took a quick inventory of the place. There was no running water, just a hand pump outside and a bucket for carrying water inside. The landline hung on the wall next to a list of emergency numbers. After a quick walk around the cabin to get my bearings, I decided to gather some firewood. The stack inside looked like it wouldn't last more than a couple of nights, and I didn't want to run out. I spent the next hour dragging fallen branches from the woods and chopping them into manageable pieces. By the time the sun dipped below the trees, I was ready to settle in. I lit the wood stove and cooked a simple dinner, beans and rice. Outside, the forest grew darker by the second. The only light came from the glow of the fire inside the cabin and the faint sliver of moonlight filtering through the trees. I didn't notice it at first, but as I sat there eating, I realized just how quiet it was. In the city, there's always noise, cars, people, planes. Out here, there was nothing, just the occasional crack of a branch or the distant call of an owl. That first night was uneventful. I fell asleep to the sound of the fire crackling in the stove and woke up with the sun streaming through the window. The second day, I decided to explore the area. I followed the creek downstream for a while, then looped back around through the woods. The forest was dense, and it was easy to lose my sense of direction, but I had my GPS watch to guide me back to the cabin. It was on the way back that I noticed something odd. About 50 yards from the cabin, I found a pile of rocks, neatly stacked, like a cairn. At first, I thought it was a marker for the trail, but there was no trail here. The rocks were smooth, worn by time, and stacked too neatly to be random. I felt a chill run down my spine, but brushed it off. Maybe it was a landmark left by hunters or hikers. I left it alone and continued back to the cabin. That night, the quiet felt different, oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every creak of the wood stove made me jump. I kept looking out the window, half expecting to see someone standing in the clearing. The next morning, I found another cairn. This one was closer to the cabin, maybe 20 yards away. The rocks were smaller, but they were stacked in the same precise way. My first thought was that someone was messing with me, but who? The nearest road was 2 miles away, and I hadn't seen another soul since I got here. I decided to stay close to the cabin that day. I split more wood, pumped water, and double-checked the locks on the door and windows. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing noises, soft rustling, like someone walking through the leaves. Twice. I got up to look out the window, but I didn't see anything. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. They weren't mine. These were larger with a heavier tread. They led from the tree line to the cabin and then back again. I packed my bag that afternoon. I wasn't planning on leaving until the end of the week, but I didn't feel safe anymore. I decided to hike back to my car the next morning. That night, I kept the wood stove burning and stayed awake as long as I could, clutching the hatchet I'd brought for chopping wood. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. My heart pounded as I listened, frozen in place. The footsteps stopped. Then, a loud bang against the door. I grabbed the landline and dialed 911, my hands shaking. The operator's voice crackled through the line, and I explained what was happening. She said she'd dispatch someone, but it could take a while. They'd have to hike in. I didn't hang up. I sat there clutching the phone, listening to the operator reassure me while the footsteps started again, circling the cabin. It felt like hours before I heard voices outside, real voices. A search and rescue team had arrived, along with a sheriff's deputy. They searched the area but didn't find anyone. The footprints around the cabin were clear, but they led into the woods and disappeared. I left with them that morning, hiking back to my car in silence. I never found out who or what was out there, but I haven't been back to the woods since. I've always enjoyed the idea of solitude. Growing up in a busy city, I'd often dream of wide open spaces, quiet evenings, and mornings filled with the crisp scent of nature. So, when I came across a remote cabin rental deep in the woods, I didn't think twice before booking it. The idea of spending a week away from emails, calls, and the constant hum of city life felt like a much-needed escape. The cabin was advertised as off-grid, with no Wi-Fi, limited phone service, and solar power for basic lighting. It sounded perfect. The photos showed a charming little place with wooden walls, a stone fireplace, and large windows overlooking a thick forest. It was everything I imagined solitude should look like. I planned my trip carefully, packing enough supplies for the week. Canned food, dry goods, a first aid kit, a flashlight with extra batteries, a hatchet for firewood, and a few books to keep me company. I didn't expect luxury, but I wasn't looking for hardship either. The drive there was long and winding. As I left the main highway and entered the back roads, the scenery changed. Trees lined the narrow road, their branches arching overhead like a natural tunnel. The further I drove, the fewer houses I saw, until there were none at all. Just trees, shadows, and the occasional rustle of leaves carried by the wind. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked just like the photos. It sat on a small clearing, surrounded by tall pines. The wood was weathered but sturdy, and the windows were spotless, reflecting the green of the forest. A small porch with a rocking chair faced the woods. It felt welcoming, but also isolated. I unloaded my car, carrying my bags inside. The interior was simple but cozy. There was a single room with a bed, a small kitchen area, and a sitting space by the fireplace. A narrow door led to a bathroom with a composting toilet and a rudimentary shower. The windows let in plenty of light, but they also made me feel exposed. After unpacking, I sat on the porch, sipping coffee and listening to the forest. It was quiet, almost unnervingly so. In the city, there's always some background noise, cars, voices, music. Here, the silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional bird call or the rustling of leaves. As the sun set, the woods seemed to come alive. I heard the chirping of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, and something larger moving through the underbrush. Probably a deer, I told myself. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I went inside, locked the door, and lit a few candles. The solar lights were dim, casting long shadows on the walls. I built a fire in the stone fireplace, its warmth and light making the cabin feel safer. I read for a while before climbing into bed. The first night was restless. I woke several times, hearing noises outside, branches snapping, something brushing against the cabin walls. Each time, I told myself it was the wind or animals, but my unease grew. By morning, I was exhausted. The next day, I decided to explore the area. I followed a trail that wound through the woods, carrying my hatchet just in case. The forest was dense, the trees towering above me. Sunlight barely reached the ground, creating a maze of shadows. About an hour into my walk, I found an old hunting blind, its wooden frame rotting and overgrown with moss. Nearby, there was a rusted trap, half buried in the dirt. It looked like no one had been here for years. As I headed back to the cabin, I noticed something strange. The underbrush along the trail had been disturbed, as if someone or something had moved through recently. I hadn't seen anyone, and the thought of another person wandering around unsettled me. Back at the cabin, I tried to shake off the unease. I spent the afternoon chopping firewood and cooking a simple meal. But as evening fell, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger this time. That night, the noises outside were louder. I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. I stayed in bed, clutching the hatchet, every muscle in my body tense. The footsteps stopped near the porch, followed by a scraping sound, like nails on wood. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When it did, I stepped outside to find scratches on the porch railing. They were deep and jagged, too large to be from any animal I could think of. I decided to leave. My escape was supposed to last a week, but I couldn't handle another night. I packed quickly, but when I tried to start my car, the engine wouldn't turn over. The battery was dead. Panic set in. There was no one to call, no nearby houses. My phone had no signal. I was alone, stranded. I spent the day trying to figure out what to do, but the options were limited. Walking back to civilization would take hours, maybe days. As night fell again, I barricaded the door with furniture and kept the hatchet by my side. The noises returned, louder than ever. Footsteps, scratching, something heavy bumping against the walls. At one point, I thought I heard breathing outside the window, low, heavy breaths, just beyond the glass. I didn't sleep that night. When dawn broke, I ventured outside cautiously. The car still wouldn't start, but I was done waiting. I packed a bag with food, water, and the hatchet and started walking. The forest was eerily quiet as I made my way down the road. Every sound, every rustle, every snap of a twig made me jump. I walked for hours, the cabin shrinking in the distance. Just when I thought I was safe, I saw them. Footprints in the dirt, fresh and human, heading in the same direction I was. They weren't mine. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I kept walking until I reached the main road, where I flagged down a passing car. I never went back for my things. I never reported the scratches or the footprints. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there. But I know this: solitude isn't always peaceful. Sometimes, being alone isn't what you should fear. It's who might be out there with you. I arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon. The drive had been longer than I expected, winding roads cutting through dense pine forests that seemed endless. It was one of those rental places I found online, marketed as a perfect getaway for people looking to escape the city. The pictures looked nice: cozy furniture, a wood-burning stove, and a view of a tranquil lake surrounded by trees. It seemed like the ideal place to clear my head for a week. The cabin sat at the end of a gravel road, a little clearing carved out of the thick woods. It was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of wind in the trees or the distant call of a bird. I stepped out of the car, stretching after the long drive, and took a deep breath. The air smelled fresh, tinged with the sharp scent of pine and damp earth. For a moment, I thought I'd made the right choice. The cabin itself was simple but charming. Wooden planks painted a deep brown, a green metal roof, and a small porch with a couple of weathered chairs. The lake was visible just beyond the trees, its surface calm and mirror-like. I unloaded my bags and headed inside. The interior was about what I expected. A small living area with a couch and a coffee table, a kitchen tucked into the corner, and a narrow staircase leading to a loft with a bed. The wood stove sat in the corner, its metal surface cold to the touch. A few shelves held books, most of them old and well-worn, along with a stack of board games and puzzles. It was quaint, quiet, and exactly what I thought I wanted. After unpacking, I decided to take a walk down to the lake. The path was well-trodden, cutting through the tall grass and leading to a small dock. The water was so still that it reflected the sky perfectly, a soft blue with wisps of clouds drifting lazily across. I sat on the edge of the dock for a while, letting my legs dangle over the side, and listened to the silence. It was peaceful in a way I wasn't used to. No cars, no city noise, just the faint hum of insects and the occasional splash of water as a fish broke the surface. As the sun dipped lower, I headed back to the cabin. I lit the wood stove for warmth, the flames crackling softly as they took hold of the logs. Dinner was simple, some canned soup and a sandwich, and afterward, I settled onto the couch with a book I'd brought along. The light from the stove flickered against the walls, casting shadows that danced and swayed with the fire. It wasn't until I went to bed that I started to feel uneasy. The cabin was so quiet that every creak of the wood or whisper of wind outside seemed amplified. I told myself it was just the unfamiliar setting, the kind of thing that always makes you hyper-aware. Still, I found myself lying awake, staring at the dark ceiling, straining to hear anything out of place. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. I woke up to the sound of something tapping. At first, I thought it was a dream, but as I lay there, I realized it was real. A soft, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere outside. I glanced at the clock, just past 3 a.m. The room was pitch black except for the faint glow of the dying embers in the stove. I tried to ignore the sound, telling myself it was probably a branch hitting the side of the cabin or maybe an animal, but it didn't stop. After a few minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. I got out of bed, grabbing the flashlight I'd brought with me, and crept down the stairs. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. As I approached the front door, my hand hovered over the handle, hesitation creeping in. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and yanked the door open. The porch was empty. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the trees and the gravel drive. The tapping had stopped the moment I opened the door. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the silence, my heart pounding in my chest. Finally, I stepped back inside and locked the door, feeling a little foolish for letting myself get so worked up. It was probably just the wind or some animal, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. The next morning, I walked around the cabin, looking for anything that could have made the sound. There were no branches near the porch, no signs of animals. I even checked the windows, thinking maybe something had been knocking against the glass. But there was nothing. I tried to brush it off and went about my day, exploring the area around the cabin and reading by the lake. But the unease lingered, a nagging feeling in the back of my mind. That night, it happened again. The same soft tapping, waking me from a dead sleep. This time, it sounded closer, more deliberate. I lay there, frozen, listening to the sound. It wasn't random. There was a rhythm to it, like someone knocking softly but insistently. My chest tightened as I realized it was coming from the back of the cabin, near the kitchen. I grabbed the flashlight and crept downstairs, every step feeling heavier than the last. The tapping continued, steady and unchanging, as I approached the kitchen. I shone the light toward the back door, my heart racing. The sound stopped abruptly, just like the night before. I hesitated, then moved closer, peering through the small window in the door. Nothing, just darkness and the faint outline of trees. The next few days passed in a blur of tension and sleepless nights. The tapping continued, always at night, always stopping the moment I got close. I stopped exploring during the day, too tired and on edge to enjoy anything. I kept the flashlight with me at all times, along with the largest kitchen knife I could find, though I wasn't sure what I was preparing for. On the fifth night, everything changed. I was sitting by the fire, unable to sleep, when I heard it again. Not tapping this time, but footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps crunching on the gravel outside. My breath caught in my throat as I realized they were coming toward the front door. I turned off the flashlight and crouched by the window, peering out into the darkness. At first, I couldn't see anything. Then, faintly, I caught movement, a shadow passing between the trees. The steps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside the door. My heart felt like it was about to burst as I waited, holding my breath, every muscle in my body tense. The handle of the door rattled, once, twice, as though someone was testing it. Then silence. I stayed frozen, my mind racing, until the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. When I finally worked up the courage to open the door, there was no one there. But in the soft dirt near the porch, I found footprints. They were large, unmistakably human, leading from the gravel road to the door and back again. I didn't stay to find out who or what was out there. I packed my things in a rush, throwing them into the car and not bothering to check if I'd left anything behind. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the road. But there was nothing. I never reported what happened. I wasn't sure what I would even say. That I'd been spooked by some noises and footprints? It didn't seem worth it. But I haven't been back to a cabin since. The idea of being alone in the woods, miles from anyone, doesn't feel peaceful anymore. It feels like an invitation for something or someone I never want to meet again. I didn't grow up camping or spending time in the woods. My family was more of the vacation in a hotel type, so the whole concept of cabins always felt foreign to me. I'd see pictures of rustic log structures surrounded by snow-tipped pines or hear friends talk about their retreats to the mountains, but I never really understood the appeal. That changed when my coworker, Rick, invited me to use his cabin for a weekend. He said it wasn't anything fancy, just a simple place in the middle of nowhere. He and his family had bought it years ago, but since his kids had grown up, they didn't use it much anymore. He practically begged me to go, claiming it was the perfect spot to clear my mind. I didn't need much convincing. Work had been relentless, and I needed a break from emails and deadlines. The cabin was a 4-hour drive from where I lived. Rick emailed me the coordinates and some vague instructions. The road isn't marked, but you'll see a crooked mailbox near a dirt path. Follow it for a couple of miles until you hit the clearing. The drive was uneventful at first. Highways turned into 2-lane roads, which turned into winding country paths. I lost cell service somewhere around the 3rd hour, but I didn't mind. I had offline maps downloaded and a playlist queued up. It wasn't until I hit the dirt road that I started feeling uneasy. The mailbox Rick mentioned was barely standing, its wooden post leaning like it had been shoved aside. The dirt path leading into the forest was narrow, with thick trees pressing in on both sides. As I drove deeper, the branches above tangled together, creating a canopy that blocked out most of the light. The sun was still up, but the woods felt darker than they should have. The cabin appeared suddenly, like it had been waiting for me to find it. It was small and old, with faded wooden walls and a tin roof that gleamed faintly in the dim light. There was a porch with a sagging chair and a small stack of firewood beside the door. It wasn't as picturesque as I'd imagined, but it had a certain charm. After parking the car, I grabbed my bag and headed inside. The air was stale, like the place hadn't been opened in months. The interior was basic, just one room with a small kitchen, a bed pushed against the wall, and a wood-burning stove. The only light came from two small windows, and even that was muted by the thick forest outside. I spent the first hour cleaning up. Dust covered everything, and there were a few mouse droppings on the counter. I opened the windows to let in some fresh air, and the forest immediately filled the cabin with its earthy scent. Felt better after that, almost cozy. That night, I lit a fire in the stove and cooked a simple meal. The quiet was overwhelming at first. No hum of appliances, no cars in the distance, just the occasional rustle of leaves and the crackle of the fire. It was peaceful, but in a way that felt almost unnatural, like the forest was holding its breath. I woke up in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had roused me. The fire in the stove had gone out, and the room was cold. The silence was oppressive, pressing against my ears like a weight. Then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound coming from outside. It was hard to describe. Not quite footsteps, but not an animal either. It was a soft crunching, like something heavy moving slowly through the underbrush. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a raccoon. Animals lived in the woods, after all. But the sound didn't stop. It circled the cabin, moving slowly, deliberately. I stayed in bed, straining to hear through the walls. The crunching paused occasionally, then resumed in a new spot. It was like whatever was out there was inspecting the place. I didn't sleep much after that. The noises eventually faded, but the unease lingered. By the time the sun came up, I was ready to pack up and leave, but part of me felt silly. I'd driven all this way for some peace and quiet, and now I was ready to abandon it because of a few noises? I convinced myself to stay, but the day felt off. The woods, which had seemed serene the day before, now felt watchful. Every time I stepped outside, I had the distinct feeling of being observed. I told myself it was paranoia, a natural reaction to being alone in an unfamiliar place. That afternoon, I decided to hike a little. There wasn't a clear trail, but I followed a dry creek bed that seemed to wind deeper into the forest. The trees grew denser as I walked, their branches twisting together in eerie shapes. After about an hour, I stumbled across something that made me stop cold. It was a clearing, but not a natural one. The trees had been cut down in a rough circle, their stumps jagged and splintered. In the center of the clearing stood a small pile of bones. They weren't arranged neatly, just scattered in a way that suggested something or someone had left them there. I didn't get close enough to examine them. My stomach churned at the sight, and my mind raced with explanations. Maybe it was a hunting spot, or maybe some animal had dragged its kills there. Either way, I turned around and headed back to the cabin, moving faster than I'd intended. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but the tension didn't ease. I locked the door before sunset and piled extra wood into the stove. The warmth didn't comfort me the way it had the night before. That night, the noises started again. This time, they were louder, closer. It was the same crunching sound, but now it came with the occasional snap of a twig or rustle of leaves. I stayed awake, gripping the flashlight I'd brought with me. At one point, I thought I saw something move outside the window, a shadow, quick and fleeting. I didn't dare investigate. When morning finally came, I made the decision to leave. I packed my bag, cleaned up the cabin as best as I could, and loaded everything into the car. But as I reached for the keys, I noticed something that made my heart drop. The front porch was covered in muddy footprints. They weren't animal tracks, they were human, barefoot judging by the shape. They circled the cabin, just like the noises I'd heard. I didn't stay to figure out what it meant. I started the car and drove out as fast as I could, the narrow dirt path feeling even more claustrophobic than before. I never told Rick about the footprints or the noises. When he asked how the trip went, I just said it was fine. But I've never gone back to that cabin, and I never will. Sometimes, late at night, I think about those footprints. Someone, or something was out there watching me, and whoever they were, they wanted me to know it.